The funeral home smelled like carnations and floor polish, and I was standing next to my mother's casket when a woman I had never seen before in my life walked through the door and stopped everyone cold. She had my mother's chin. She had my own eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaking so hard the words barely came out whole. "I know this isn't the time, but I've been looking for this family for 39 years, and I read the obituary 3 days ago, and I couldn't wait any longer. My name is Diane. I think Margaret Whitfield was my mother too." Nobody moved. My brother Tommy's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. My father, sitting in the front row in his good gray suit, went the color of the wall behind him, and I just stood there, 44 years old, holding a program with my mother's photograph on it, staring at a stranger who had my face. "That's not possible," I finally said. "I don't have a sister." But even as I said it, something in my chest already knew I was wrong. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming video. To understand how I ended up standing in that funeral home, with my whole life cracking open in front of 200 people, you have to go back. Not 39 years. Let me start where I actually remember things starting. The summer I turned 9, the summer everything in my family was still simple, before I understood that the people who love you can also be the ones keeping the biggest secret of your life. My name is Claire Whitfield, and I grew up in Millbrook, Ohio, a town so small you could walk from one end of Main Street to the other in under 10 minutes. We had one stoplight. We had a Dairy Queen that closed every October and reopened every April like clockwork, and everybody in town treated that reopening like a holiday. My father, Walter Whitfield, ran the hardware store his own father had built. My mother, Margaret, taught 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary, the same school I went to, which meant I spent my whole childhood being Mrs. Whitfield's daughter to half the town. My older brother Tommy was 5 years ahead of me, already tall and confident by the time I was old enough to really notice him, the kind of boy teachers wrote glowing notes home about. We lived in a white house on Chestnut Street with a porch swing my dad built the summer before I was born. I have 100 small, warm memories of that porch. My mother snapping green beans into a bowl in her lap, my father coming home from the store smelling like sawdust and WD-40, swinging me up onto his shoulders even when I was really getting too big for it. Tommy teaching me to ride a bike in the church parking lot, running alongside me with his hand on the back of my seat, yelling, I've got you," right up until the moment he let go, and I didn't even notice for half a block. We were, by every outward measure, a happy family, and for a long time we were. My mother had a way of making ordinary days feel like they mattered. She kept a recipe box with cards in her mother's handwriting and her grandmother's handwriting, layered on top of each other like sediment. She sang along to the radio while she did dishes, always a half step off key, and she never once seemed embarrassed about it. On my birthday every year, she woke me up by sitting on the edge of my bed and singing to me before I even opened my eyes, and I would pretend to still be asleep just to make it last a little longer. My father was quieter. He wasn't a man who said, I love you easily, but he showed it in the corners of things. The way he always saved me the last piece of pie without asking if I wanted it. The way he taught me to check the oil in a car and change a tire before I even had my learner's permit. Because he said a girl should never have to depend on somebody else to get herself home safe. I loved my brother too, in the uncomplicated way you love someone before you're old enough to notice the small unfairnesses stacking up around you. Tommy was funny. He did impressions of our teachers that made me laugh so hard I'd get the hiccups. He let me tag along to the creek behind the Andersons' property, even though his friends complained about having a little sister underfoot. For most of my childhood, if you'd asked me to describe my family, I would have used the word lucky. It wasn't until I was about 11 that I started noticing the small things. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anyone watching from the outside would have called wrong. Just little moments that left a faint bruise if you paid attention to how often they happened. Like the time Tommy and I both brought home report cards the same week. Mine had all A's except a B+ in math. Tommy's had 2 C's and a note from his algebra teacher about missing assignments. My father sat at the kitchen table with both report cards in front of him, and I remember waiting for him to say something to me first, because mine was better, because I had worked hard for it. Instead, he looked at Tommy's and said, Algebra's hard for everybody. We'll get you a tutor, bud. Don't worry about it. Then he glanced at mine and said, B+ in math, huh? In a tone that made the A's disappear like they'd never existed. I didn't think much of it at the time. I told myself Tommy needed more help, and that was fair. and my father wasn't wrong to focus his worry where the worry was needed. That's the thing about small unfairnesses. They always come with a reasonable-sounding explanation attached. And when you're a kid who loves your father, you reach for that explanation every single time, because the alternative is too painful to hold on to. There were other things, spread out over years, small enough that no single one of them would have been worth mentioning on its own. When Tommy wrecked the family car at 17, my father was angry for exactly one evening and then it was over, replaced by his careful new project of teaching Tommy defensive driving in the church lot on weekends. When I was 17 and got caught out an hour past curfew because my friend's car broke down on the county road, my father didn't speak to me for 3 days and brought it up at Thanksgiving dinner the following year, like it had happened the week before. My mother noticed. I know now that she noticed, because years later she told me so herself, in a hospital room, near the end, when there was no more reason left to pretend. But at the time, she never said anything out loud. She would just find small ways to balance the scale after the fact, an extra hour of just the two of us doing something I wanted to do, a note tucked into my lunch bag that said something like, "You are the best part of my day," words she never wrote for Tommy, because Tommy, she always said, already knows he's loved plenty. I used to think that meant I needed the reassurance more. Now I think it meant she was trying to make up for something she couldn't bring herself to name. Tommy went off to Ohio State, the first Whitfield to go to a 4-year college, and my father drove up for every home football game, whether Tommy invited him or not, standing in the parking lot in a scarlet and gray jacket he'd bought special, grinning like a man who'd finally arrived somewhere. I went to Millbrook Community College 2 years later for an associate's degree in accounting, and my father came to exactly one event the whole 2 years, my graduation, and left before the reception because he said he had to get back to the store. I told myself that was just how he was. Practical, not sentimental about community college, the way he was sentimental about the Buckeyes. I built him 100 small excuses over the years, brick by brick, until I had something that looked almost like a wall, strong enough to keep the truth out. I met my husband, David, at 23, working the books for a small trucking company outside of Millbrook. He was steady in a way that felt like coming home after being cold for a long time. We got married in the backyard of the Chestnut Street house, under a tent my father and Tommy put up together, the two of them actually laughing at something as they wrestled with tent poles in the July heat. And I remember standing at my window watching them and thinking, this is what family is supposed to look like. Two people who love each other, working toward the same thing, side by side. I didn't know yet how much of that image was something I needed to believe, rather than something that was fully true. David and I had 2 kids, Sophie, now 16, and Ben, 13, and we stayed in Millbrook, in a house 4 streets over from the one I grew up in, close enough that my mother could walk to see her grandkids most Sundays. My father came less often. He always had a reason: the store, his knees, a ball game on TV he didn't want to miss. My mother came alone so often that eventually, I stopped expecting anything different, the way you stop expecting rain in a drought, not because you've made peace with it, but because hoping for it has become its own kind of exhausting. My mother started forgetting things the winter I turned 40. Small things at first. She'd call to ask if Sunday dinner was at 1 or 2, and I'd tell her 1, and 20 minutes later she'd call back and ask the same question like the first call had never happened. She'd put her keys in the refrigerator. She told the same story about her own mother's biscuit recipe 3 times in one visit, each time with the same warmth, like she was hearing it fresh. I noticed. David noticed. Tommy, who by then had moved back to Millbrook after a rough patch in his marriage, his second divorce, finalized the year before, noticed too, and he was the one who said the word first, sitting at my parents' kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, while my mother napped upstairs. "I think we need to get Mom checked out," he said. "This isn't normal forgetting." My father's jaw tightened, the way it always did, when something threatened to be real instead of manageable. "She's tired," he said. "Teaching wore her down for 30 years. She's allowed to be tired." "Dad, she's been retired for 8 years. She's tired," my father said again, like repeating it would make it true, and for a moment, none of us said anything else, because we all understood, without saying it out loud, that my father was not ready to know what we were all already starting to suspect. That conversation was the last ordinary Sunday I remember. Everything after it moved a little faster, a little heavier, like a car picking up speed on a downhill grade you don't notice until you're already going too fast to stop easily. The diagnosis came 4 months later. Early-stage Alzheimer's, the neurologist said, in the gentle, careful voice doctors use when they're handing you a sentence instead of just information. My mother sat in that office, holding my father's hand so tightly her knuckles went white, and she said, in a voice steadier than any of ours, "Well, I suppose we'd better get things in order then." None of us understood yet what "getting things in order" was going to mean, or how much that phrase would end up costing me before this was over. I only knew that something in my chest went cold and small, like a door closing somewhere I couldn't see yet, and that whatever came next was going to change all of us. I had no idea how much. After the diagnosis, my father did something none of us expected. He called a family meeting, an actual meeting, with a legal pad and a pen, sitting at the head of the kitchen table, like he used to sit at the head of the store's monthly staff meetings, back when I was a kid tagging along after school. Tommy and I sat across from each other. My mother sat beside my father, quiet, her hands folded in her lap. "I want to get power of attorney sorted," my father said, "financial and medical both, while your mother can still tell us what she wants." It made sense. It was the responsible thing to do, and I remember feeling almost relieved that my father was handling this the way he handled everything. Head on, practical, no wasted time on feelings when there was a task in front of him. "I think it should be Tommy," my father said next, and the room went very quiet. "Why Tommy?" I asked, and I want to be honest. It wasn't jealousy, not at first. It was confusion. I was the one with the accounting background. I was the one who balanced my parents' checkbook every few months when my mother's arithmetic started slipping. I was the one who lived close enough to drive over at any hour. "He's got more time," my father said. "He's between jobs right now." Tommy had been between jobs for the better part of 2 years by then, ever since his second marriage ended and he'd walked away from a regional manager position at an auto parts distributor, under circumstances nobody in the family talked about directly. I loved my brother, I did, but more time felt like a strange qualification for handling my parents' entire financial future. "I do the books for a living, Dad," I said. "I could set up automatic bill pay, track everything, keep clean records." "Tommy's family too," my father said, in a tone that ended the conversation rather than continued it. "This isn't a competition, Claire. I want to tell you," I pushed back harder, "I didn't. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight, that my father was under enormous stress, that questioning him too hard might come across as though I thought my own mother's care was some kind of prize to be won. I told myself Tommy needed this, needed a reason to feel useful again, after 2 years of feeling like the family disappointment. I told myself a dozen reasonable things, and every one of them was another brick in that wall I'd been building since I was 11 years old, watching my father look at 2 report cards and choose which child's struggle mattered more. So Tommy became the one with power of attorney. Tommy became the one who started handling my parents' mail, their bills, their bank statements. Tommy became the one who drove my mother to her specialist appointments in Columbus, an hour each way, while I stayed home with Sophie and Ben, and told myself I was helping in my own way, by keeping things steady for the kids so my parents wouldn't have to worry about us on top of everything else. For a while it looked fine. Tommy seemed to take it seriously. He'd call with updates. "Dr. Meyer wants to try a new medication. The insurance is fighting us on the home health aid again." And I'd feel a small flush of gratitude that my brother had finally found his footing, that this crisis had given him a purpose, the way nothing else in his adult life quite had. It was my mother who first planted the seed of doubt, and she did it so gently I almost missed it. I was over at the house on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, helping her go through a box of old photographs, because she said she wanted to make sure things were labeled before I forget who everybody is. A joke that landed like a stone every time she made it. We were sitting on the living room floor, pictures spread across the rug, when she picked up an old bank statement that had gotten mixed in with the photos somehow and squinted at it. "That's strange," she said. "I don't remember approving this." "Approving what, Mom?" She held it out to me. It was a transfer, $4,000, moved from my parents' joint savings account into an account I didn't recognize, dated 6 weeks earlier. My mother's memory wasn't what it used to be, but she still knew her own finances better than most people twice as sharp, because for 30 years she had been the one who balanced the household books while my father ran the store. "I don't remember this," she said again, and there was something in her voice that wasn't confusion. It was worry, clear and lucid, cutting through the fog for just a moment. "Ask your brother about it, would you? I don't want to bother your father." Moo. I meant to ask Tommy that very week. But then Sophie got strep throat, and Ben had a school project due, and David's mother had a small stroke that turned into a 2-week ordeal of hospital visits and physical therapy scheduling, and the question about the bank statement got pushed to the back of my mind, the way urgent but not emergency things always do when life keeps handing you emergencies. By the time I remembered to ask, 3 more weeks had gone by, and when I finally brought it up to Tommy over the phone, he had an answer ready so fast it almost sounded rehearsed. "That's for Mom and Dad's home care fund," he said. "I'm setting up a separate account so the money for the aid doesn't get mixed in with their regular spending. Makes the taxes cleaner. You'd understand that better than me, being the numbers person." It made sense. It sounded exactly like the kind of thing a responsible person handling power of attorney would do. And there was something almost flattering in the way he said, "You'd understand that better than me." A small olive branch between siblings who'd spent our whole lives being measured against each other, and I took it, gratefully, because I wanted so badly to believe my brother had grown into the responsibility my father had handed him. I didn't ask to see the account. I didn't ask for statements. I told myself that would look like I didn't trust him, and trust was supposed to be the whole point of family. Looking back now, I understand that the $4,000 was never really about the money. It was a test, a small one, low stakes enough that if anyone noticed, there was an easy explanation ready to go. And when nobody pushed harder than a single phone call, that test told Tommy something important. It told him how much room he had. Over the following year, that room got used. My mother's decline was not steady. It came in stretches of plateau, followed by sudden, frightening drops, the way water finds its way down a hillside, patient for a long while, and then all at once. She started needing help with things that had been effortless for her a year before. Getting dressed. Remembering which of her grandchildren belonged to which of her children. Remembering, some days, that my father was her husband, and not simply a kind man who came around a lot. My father aged in those same months in a way that frightened me more than my mother's decline did, because his was a different kind of forgetting, not memory, but denial. He started skipping the support group the neurologist's office recommended. He stopped correcting my mother when she called him by her own father's name, because correcting her made her cry, and he couldn't bear to make her cry more than the disease already did on its own. And somewhere in the middle of all that grief and exhaustion, Tommy quietly became the only one of us with a full, unobstructed view of my parents' finances. I found out how unobstructed almost by accident, at a Sunday dinner 9 months after that first bank statement my mother had shown me. My father, in one of his rare candid moods, mentioned that he'd asked Tommy to refinance the house. "Refinance?" I said. "Why would you refinance?" "The house has been paid off for years. Home care costs money, Claire Bear," my father said, using the nickname he hadn't used in probably a decade, which told me how tired he really was underneath the practical tone. The aid, the medications that insurance won't cover, all of it adds up. Tommy found us a good rate, pulled some equity out to cover things. How much equity? My father waved a hand, the gesture of a man who had decided a long time ago that numbers were someone else's department. "Ask your brother. He's got all that figured out." I did ask my brother, and for the first time, his answer came a half-second too slow, his eyes sliding toward the window before they came back to me. "About 60,000, he said. "It's fine, Claire. It's covering costs. I've got spreadsheets if you want to see them." I did want to see them. I asked. He said he'd email them that week. He didn't. I asked again 2 weeks later, and he said his laptop had crashed and he was working with an IT guy to recover the files, which was such a strange, specific excuse that some small cold part of me should have caught fire with suspicion right then. Instead, I let it go again. Because David's mother needed a second round of physical therapy. Because Sophie had started struggling in a way that would later turn out to be the beginning of a genuine anxiety disorder, something that would take up so much of my attention over the following year that everything else in my life became background noise. Because my own mother, the woman who used to sit on the edge of my bed and sing to me on my birthday, sometimes looked at me now with polite, careful confusion, like I was someone she was trying very hard to place. Grief and distraction are a manipulator's best cover. I didn't know that phrase yet. I would learn it, later, in a lawyer's office, reading documents that made my stomach drop through the floor. But at the time, I only knew that I was tired in a way I had never been tired before, and that my brother, for all his old faults, was the one showing up every single week to manage the parts of this crisis that I simply did not have the bandwidth to manage myself. That's what made it so easy for him. Not cruelty, not even greed, not really, not at first. Just an open door, held open by exhaustion and love and the desperate human need to believe the people in your family are better than the small, cold evidence sometimes suggests. The year my mother's disease crossed into what her doctor called moderate stage was the same year Tommy moved my parents into a smaller house. He framed it as compassion. "The Chestnut Street house is too big for them now," he said, sitting across from me at my kitchen table, with a folder of listings already printed out, already highlighted, already so far along in the process that it was clear this wasn't a proposal so much as a notification. "Dad can't keep up with the yard. Mom gets confused in a house that size. Too many rooms, too many stairs. A single-story place closer to town would be so much easier for the aide, for appointments, for all of it." Every word of it was true. That was the maddening part. Every individual fact Tommy laid out was reasonable, even kind. It was only in hindsight, months later, that I understood how a person can build an entire structure of manipulation out of nothing but true bricks, stacked in exactly the order that leads somewhere you never would have agreed to walk if you'd seen the whole path at once. "Who's handling the sale?" I asked. "I've got a realtor. Friend of mine from high school, actually. Gives family a discount on commission." "And the proceeds go where?" Tommy's jaw did something small and tight. "There and gone so fast I almost missed it." "Into their account." "Where else would they go, Claire?" I didn't have an answer for that, except the plain fact that I had asked to see records for over a year and never once actually seen them. But saying that out loud felt like an accusation I wasn't ready to make. Not with our mother sitting in a specialist's waiting room 40 minutes away, not with our father looking 10 years older every time I saw him, not with everything in our family already stretched so thin that any pressure in the wrong place felt like it might snap something that could never be put back together. The Chestnut Street house sold for $210,000. I know that now because I eventually saw the closing documents, much later, in circumstances I never wanted. At the time, all I knew was that my parents moved into a modest single-story rental on the edge of town. Not a purchase, a rental, which struck me as strange for people who'd just sold a paid-off house for over $200,000. But Tommy had an answer ready for that too. "Renting gives us flexibility," he said. "If Mom needs to move into full memory care sooner than we think, we're not stuck trying to sell a house in a hurry." Flexibility. That word did a lot of work in Tommy's explanations that year. Flexibility for the equity he'd pulled from the refinance. Flexibility for renting instead of buying. Flexibility, even, for why he'd started handling my parents' mail at a P.O. box instead of their home address, so nothing gets lost in the move. I want to be honest about something, because this story only means anything if I'm honest. There were moments during that year when a real, cold suspicion rose up in me, sharp enough that I could have acted on it. I remember one night in particular, lying awake next to David, saying out loud into the dark, "I think Tommy might be taking money from Mom and Dad." David didn't dismiss it. He asked me what I wanted to do about it. And I didn't have an answer, because the thought that followed the suspicion was always the same thought, the one that had been trained into me since I was 11 years old watching 2 report cards get weighed on an uneven scale. If I push on this, and I'm wrong, I will look like the jealous sister who couldn't stand her brother finally being trusted with something important. If I push on this, and I'm right, I will be the one who tore this family apart during the worst year of my mother's life. Either way, in my mind, I lost. So I did nothing. I told myself I'd keep watching, keep asking gentle questions, keep my eyes open without making a scene, and that felt, at the time, like a responsible middle path. It was not. It was the same door, held open a little wider. My father's health started failing that same winter. A mild heart attack in February that put him in Millbrook Memorial for 4 days and left him weaker than he wanted to admit. Sitting in that hospital room, watching my father hooked up to monitors, watching my mother sit beside his bed in a wheelchair of her own because her balance had gotten too unreliable for her to stand for long periods, I remember thinking that our family had entered some kind of siege. Everything was triage. Everything was survival. There was no room left over for anything as small and selfish feeling as an audit of my brother's bookkeeping. Tommy was there every day of that hospital stay, and to his credit, he was genuinely good in a crisis, in a way that surprised me. He talked to doctors in plain language and translated it for the rest of us. He brought my mother her own blanket from home, because hospital blankets made her anxious. He sat up 2 nights in the recliner so my father wouldn't wake up alone. Watching him, I felt something loosen in my chest, a hope that maybe I'd been unfair. maybe the missing paperwork and the slow answers really were just disorganization and not something darker. That's the part of this story that still haunts me the most, honestly. Not that my brother was capable of what he was doing. People are capable of far worse than money troubles when they're desperate and afraid and have convinced themselves they deserve more than they've gotten. What haunts me is how easily his genuine goodness in some moments made it possible for me to overlook his dishonesty in others. A villain who is cruel all the time is easy to see clearly. A person who shows up, who sits up all night in an uncomfortable recliner for a father who never once came to your college graduation, that person is much harder to hold fully accountable, because some real part of what they're giving you is real. My father recovered from the heart attack well enough to come home, though the cardiologist made clear his heart was weaker than it used to be, and every future event carried more risk. It was around then, in the spring, that my father asked Tommy and me both to come by the rental house on a Saturday morning, saying he wanted to talk about what happens next. I arrived to find Tommy already there, a manila folder in front of him on the kitchen table, and my father looking tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. "I want to update the will," my father said, "and I want to talk about the trust your mother and I set up years back, for both of you kids, equally, like it's always been." I nodded. That trust had existed since I was in high school, a modest fund my grandparents had started that had grown over the decades, meant to be split evenly between Tommy and me whenever my parents passed. It had never been a huge amount of money, not by any dramatic standard, but it represented something important to my parents. Fairness, finally, on paper if nowhere else. "I want to make some changes," my father said, and something in his voice made the back of my neck go cold before I even understood why. Given everything Tommy's taken on this year, the finances, the move, sitting with me at the hospital, I think it's only right that the trust reflect that. I'm thinking 60-40, maybe 70-30. I looked at Tommy. Tommy was looking down at the folder in front of him, not meeting my eyes, and something about the specific way he wasn't meeting my eyes told me, with sudden and total clarity, that this conversation had not started that morning. This had been discussed before, planned before, and I was the last one being brought into a decision that had already, functionally, been made. "Dad," I said, "I've been doing just as much. I do the kids' schedules, You're not the one who's been handling the money," my father said, and there it was, the same scale, tipped the same direction it had been tipped my entire life, except this time the stakes weren't a report card. This time the stakes were real, and permanent, and about to become the kind of unfair that money makes impossible to pretend away. I left that kitchen that Saturday morning angrier than I had been in years, and underneath the anger, for the first time, was real fear. Not for my inheritance, though I won't pretend that didn't sting, but fear that whatever was actually happening with my parents' money was so much bigger than a P.O. box and a refinance and a house sold quietly for $210,000. I didn't know yet how right that fear was. I also didn't know, standing in that driveway with my keys shaking slightly in my hand, that the true shape of what I was about to discover had nothing to do with money at all, not at its root. The money was real, and it mattered, and what my brother had done with it would come to matter enormously in the months ahead. But underneath the money, underneath 30 years of small unfairnesses I had spent my whole life explaining away, there was an older secret entirely, one that had nothing to do with Tommy, and everything to do with why my father had never quite been able to look at me the same way he looked at my brother. Not because I was less loved, but because I was, in some way I could not yet imagine, a living reminder of something my parents had spent 4 decades trying not to remember themselves. The trust changed to a 70-30 split 3 weeks later. I found out not from my father, but from a copy of the amended paperwork that arrived at my house by mistake, mixed in with some medical bills the estate attorney's office sent to the wrong sibling. I sat at my kitchen table reading my own name reduced to 30% of something that had always, my entire life, been described to me as equal, and I felt something crack open in my chest that had been holding steady since I was 9 years old. I didn't call my father, I called my mother. It was one of her better days, one of the lucid stretches that came less and less often, but still arrived sometimes like sunlight breaking through clouds you'd stopped expecting to part. She answered the phone herself, which had become rare enough that I nearly cried just hearing her voice sound like her own voice. "Mom," I said, "did you know Dad changed the trust? It's 70-30 now. Tommy's 70. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I thought maybe the fog had rolled back in already. Maybe I'd lost her again, mid-sentence, the way I sometimes did. No, she finally said, and her voice had an edge to it I hadn't heard in years. Something sharp and clear cutting through the disease like it had never touched her at all. No, I did not know that. Your father discussed that with Tommy without me. Claire, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it soon, while I can still ask you to. Anything, Mom? There's a box in the hall closet at the rental house. Green, with a lid that doesn't quite fit right. It's up on the top shelf, behind the winter coats. I want you to get it and keep it somewhere safe. Don't tell your father. Don't tell Tommy. Just get it and keep it, and when I'm gone. Her voice caught, just slightly, on the word gone, but she pushed through it with a kind of determination I recognized from every hard thing I'd ever watched her do. When I'm gone, you open it, not before. I need you to promise me that. Mom, what's in it? Things I should have told you a long time ago, she said. Things I was too much of a coward to say out loud while I still could. Promise me, Claire. I promised her. Of course I promised her. I would have promised her anything. Hearing that kind of clarity and that kind of pain in her voice at the same time, a combination I had not heard from my mother in over a year. I retrieved the box 2 days later, while my father was at a cardiology follow-up and Tommy was, according to the calendar he'd started keeping on the family group text, handling some paperwork downtown. The box was heavier than it looked, an old case with a faded floral pattern, the kind of thing that might once have held sewing supplies or Christmas ornaments. I carried it out to my car wrapped in a beach towel, feeling like a criminal in my own parents' house, and I drove it home and put it on the top shelf of my own closet, behind David's old suit bags, and I did not open it. I promised her I wouldn't, and even in the middle of everything else falling apart, that promise felt like the one clean thing I could still hold on to. I didn't have to wait long to open it. My mother died 11 weeks later, in her sleep, at the rental house, with a home hospice nurse checking on her every few hours, and my father asleep in the next room, having finally, mercifully, not been awake to watch it happen. The call came at 5:40 in the morning, and I remember standing in my kitchen in the dark, phone against my ear, feeling the whole architecture of my life quietly buckle. The funeral was scheduled for the following Saturday, and it was at that funeral, at my own mother's funeral, in a room full of people who had known our family for decades, that Diane walked through the door and said the words that split my life into a clean before and after. I think Margaret Whitfield was my mother too. I want to take you back to that moment now, because everything I've told you up to this point, the report cards, the trust, the box in the closet, the 70-30 split, all of it had been building toward a single afternoon that none of us saw coming, even though, in hindsight, every piece of my life had been quietly pointing toward it the whole time. My father stood up so fast his chair scraped loud against the funeral home's hardwood floor. "Get out," he said, his voice shaking in a way I had genuinely never heard from him before, not even at the hospital, not even at my mother's bedside. "Get out of here, right now, you have no right." "Walter." My father's own brother, my Uncle Frank, put a hand on his arm, but my father shook it off. "I have every right," Diane said, and she wasn't shouting, which somehow made it worse, made it land harder, the way quiet truth always cuts deeper than a loud accusation. "I have a birth certificate, with Margaret Whitfield's name on it. I have an adoption file that took me 11 years and $4,000 in records requests to track down. I am not here to make a scene at a funeral. I am here because I have been looking for my mother since I was 17 years old, and I found out 3 days ago, from an obituary, that I found her 1 week too late." The room had gone so silent, I could hear the air conditioning cycling on in the ceiling vents. Tommy was staring at Diane with an expression I couldn't read. Not shock, exactly. Something closer to recognition, like a man seeing a ghost he'd half expected to see eventually. I found out later that Tommy had known, not everything, not the details, not the name, but he'd overheard enough as a teenager, fragments of arguments behind closed doors, to understand that our parents were carrying something heavy from before I was born, something that had shaped the whole architecture of how our father loved his children, unevenly, guiltily, in a way that never quite made sense until you understood what he was trying to make up for. I didn't know any of that yet, standing there in that funeral home. I only knew that the woman in front of me had my mother's chin, and my own eyes, and that some part of me, some part that had spent 44 years quietly wondering why my father's love always seemed to be measured out with a hand that shook slightly, like it was afraid of giving too much, recognized her, too, even before I understood why. "I need to sit down," I said, and David got me to a chair just as my legs decided they were done holding me up. The rest of the funeral happened in fragments after that. My father left before the burial, walking out to his car alone, refusing anyone's help, and I remember watching him go and feeling, for the first time in my adult life, something closer to pity than anger. Though the anger was coming, I could feel it gathering somewhere, just behind my ribs, waiting for grief to loosen its grip long enough to let something harder take its place. Diane didn't come to the burial. She left her number with the funeral director and a single sentence for me, relayed through him, because she said she didn't want to push herself into a family's grief any further than she already had. Whenever you're ready to talk, I'll be here. I'm not trying to take anything from you. I just want to know my mother's story before it's too late for that, too. That night, after David had gotten the kids to bed and the house had gone quiet, I took the green box down from the top shelf of my closet for the first time since the day I'd carried it out of my parents' rental house wrapped in a beach towel. I sat on my bedroom floor, the way I used to sit on my mother's living room floor going through old photographs, and I opened the lid, and I began, finally, to understand. The first thing I found was a stack of letters, maybe 30 of them, tied together with a faded blue ribbon that had gone soft and gray with age. Each envelope was addressed the same way, in my mother's neat teacher's handwriting, to my daughter, wherever you are. None of them had stamps. None of them had ever been mailed. Some were dated from the year I was born. Others were dated much later. One from the year I graduated high school, one from the year Sophie was born, one from just 8 months before my mother died, the handwriting shakier by then but still recognizably hers. I opened the oldest one first, my hands not quite steady. My mother had been 19 years old and unmarried when she got pregnant with Diane, the letter explained, 4 years before she ever met my father. Her own parents, my grandparents, people I had known only as kind, quiet churchgoers who died when I was a teenager, had been devout in a way that left no room for what they called, in the language of that era, a mistake. They sent my mother to stay with a cousin 2 states away for the final months of the pregnancy, and when the baby was born, they arranged a closed adoption before my mother had even fully recovered from the delivery. She never held her daughter, the letter said. She asked to, and was told it would only make things harder, and at 19, grieving and ashamed and entirely dependent on her parents for a place to live, she didn't have the strength to fight for something everyone around her had already decided. She met my father 2 years later. She told him about the baby before they married. She was clear about that in the letter, clear in a way that made something in my chest ache with old, unnecessary shame on her behalf. My father had said it didn't change how he felt about her. But over the years, the letter admitted, it became something neither of them could talk about without it turning into an argument neither of them could win, because there was no version of the conversation that didn't circle back to a decision that couldn't be undone. I think your father has spent our whole marriage trying to prove to himself he's a good man, my mother wrote, in a letter dated the year I turned 12, by being harder on himself than he needs to be, and sometimes, without meaning to, harder on you than you deserve. I don't think he even knows he does it. I think every time he looks at you, some small part of him remembers the daughter we don't talk about, and it makes him afraid of loving you too openly, like loving you too much would somehow be unfair to her. I have tried to explain to him, more times than I can count, that it doesn't work that way. Love isn't a pie with only so many slices. But grief makes people do arithmetic that doesn't make sense, and your father has been doing that arithmetic since before you were even born. I sat on my bedroom floor and read that paragraph 4 times, and each time, something in me that had been braced and defended for 35 years quietly came undone. It wasn't that I loved him less, reading it. It was that I finally understood, not excused, but understood, what all those small unfairnesses had actually been about. They had never been about me at all. They had been about a wound my father never let himself heal from, one he'd been carrying since before I was born, one that had nothing to do with report cards or curfews, or which of his children he drove an hour to see play football. The later letters were harder to read, not because the writing got worse, but because the grief in them never faded the way I think my mother hoped it would. In the letter dated the year Sophie was born, she wrote, I have a granddaughter now, and I find myself doing arithmetic too, wondering if you have children, wondering if I have great-grandchildren I will never meet, wondering if you ever think of me the way I think of you, every single day, in the quiet moments when nobody is watching me do it. The last letter, the one dated 8 months before she died, was shorter than the others, the handwriting looser, some of the letters trailing off at the ends of words, the way handwriting does when the hand holding the pen is starting to fail. I don't know if I'll get to find you before this disease takes the last of what's left of me, she wrote. I have asked Claire to keep this box and open it when I'm gone, because I think she's the only one of my children with the patience to understand what I'm about to ask of her. If you ever find your way to us, Claire, please help her understand that I searched for her more times than your father ever knew. I paid for a registry search in 1998 and another in 2011, and both times the trail went cold, and both times I told myself it was a sign I should let it go, and both times I was lying to myself, because a mother never lets it go. Not really, not ever. If she's out there, tell her I loved her every single day of her life, even the days I never got to see. Underneath the letters was the original adoption paperwork, a name I didn't recognize typed onto a birth certificate, Baby Girl Coleman, my mother's maiden name, along with a small black and white photograph of a newborn, the only image my mother had ever been allowed to keep, taken by a nurse who my mother's later letter described as the one kind person in that whole cold building. And beneath that, folded at the very bottom of the box, was something I hadn't expected at all. A thick manila folder of bank statements, photocopied, organized by date, in handwriting that took me a full minute to recognize as my mother's, because it was so much shakier than her handwriting in the letters. My mother had been keeping her own quiet records, somewhere in that stretch of moderate stage decline, in whatever lucid windows the disease still allowed her. She had apparently begun to suspect what Tommy was doing, and she had done the only thing available to a woman who could no longer trust her own memory to hold facts steady. She wrote them down, over and over, dates and amounts and account numbers, cross-referenced against bank statements Tommy didn't know she still had copies of, because he'd assumed, reasonably, that a woman with advancing Alzheimer's wouldn't notice discrepancies, let alone document them. The paper trail my mother had assembled, in her own failing hand, traced over $63,000, moved out of my parents' accounts over 18 months, into an account with Tommy's name on it, above and beyond the $60,000 from the refinance, above and beyond the $210,000 from the sale of the Chestnut Street house, money that had never made it into any home care fund at all, based on the balances my mother had copied down. There were also 2 documents that made my stomach turn over entirely. Photocopies of financial power of attorney forms with my father's signature on them, dated during a stretch of time my mother had noted, in the margin, in trembling letters. Walter was in the hospital this week. He did not sign this. I don't know how Tommy got this. I sat on that bedroom floor until nearly 3 a.m, surrounded by 30 years of my mother's grief in one hand and 18 months of my brother's betrayal in the other, and I understood, finally and completely, that the family I thought I'd grown up in had never been the whole family at all. There had always been a fourth Whitfield, missing from every photograph, present in every small unfairness I'd spent my whole life explaining away. And there had also, quietly, invisibly, been a fraud unfolding right under all of our noses, hidden behind the reasonable-sounding words my brother had gotten so good at using: flexibility, home care fund, taxes cleaner, while our mother's mind slipped away and our father's grief made him too afraid to ask the questions that might have caught it sooner. I called David into the bedroom around 3:30, and I showed him everything, and I remember him going very quiet, the way he does when he's angry, in a way that has nowhere immediate to go. "You need a lawyer," he finally said. "Not just for the money, for your dad too. If Tommy forged his signature while he was in the hospital, that's not a family disagreement anymore, Claire. That's a crime." I knew he was right, but before I called a lawyer, there was something else I needed to do first, something that felt more urgent than any legal consequence waiting for my brother. I picked up my phone, and I called the number Diane had left with the funeral director, and when she answered, sounding tired and braced for rejection, I said the only thing that felt true enough to say. "I found the letters," I told her. "I think you need to see them. I think we both do." Diane came to my house 2 days later, sitting at my kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she never drank, reading our mother's handwriting for the first time in her life. I watched her get to the letter from the year she turned 17. The year, she told me later, she had first requested her own adoption file from the state, only to be told the records were sealed and would likely stay that way. And I watched her shoulders start to shake, silently, the way people cry when they've spent decades teaching themselves not to. "She looked for me," Diane said, when she could speak again. "She actually looked for me. I used to lie awake as a teenager telling myself she probably never thought about it twice, that it was easier for her to just move on and have her real family, and forget the one mistake that got in the way. I built this whole story about her in my head to protect myself, and it was wrong. It was so wrong. She never got to tell you herself, I said. I'm sorry. I wish more than anything you'd gotten here 1 week sooner. Me too, Diane said. But I'm here now, and apparently, so are you. We spent that entire afternoon and most of the evening at my kitchen table, trading the outlines of two entirely separate lives that had somehow grown from the same root. Diane had been raised by a kind, unremarkable couple in Toledo, an insurance adjuster and a hospital receptionist. Good people who loved her, but never quite filled the specific, nameless absence she'd carried her whole life, the sense of being loved without being fully known. She'd become a nurse, ironically enough, spent 15 years in a memory care unit, of all places, caring for patients exactly like the mother she didn't yet know she'd lost. She'd married, divorced, had one daughter of her own, now 20, studying to become a nurse herself. She'd started the search for her birth family, seriously, 11 years ago, after her adoptive mother passed away, and something in her decided it was finally safe to go looking for the other half of her story, without it feeling like a betrayal. Somewhere in that long conversation, I told her about Tommy, about the $60,000 from the refinance, the $210,000 from the house, the $63,000 my mother had tracked in her own trembling hand, the forged power of attorney signed while our father lay in a hospital bed. Diane, who had every reason in the world to feel like an outsider to this particular crisis, listened without a hint of distance, her nurse's instincts kicking in almost immediately. You need documentation of his cognitive state during that hospitalization, she said. Medical records, discharge notes, medication logs, anything that shows he wasn't in a condition to knowingly sign legal paperwork. I've testified in situations like this before, for patients' families. It's more common than people think, and it's more provable than people think, if you move carefully and don't tip your hand too early. I hired a lawyer the following week, an elder law attorney in Columbus named Patricia Ruiz, who specialized in exactly this kind of case. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, layered on top of an inheritance dispute that was, by that point, the least of anyone's real concerns. Patricia moved fast and quiet. She subpoenaed the hospital records from my father's heart attack. She pulled the refinance paperwork and had a forensic document examiner compare the signatures. She requested full statements from the account Tommy had opened, the one my mother had first spotted $4,000 flowing into, years before any of us understood what we were looking at. The forensic examiner's report came back 11 days later, and it was worse than any of us had let ourselves imagine. The signature on the refinance authorization, dated during my father's 4-day hospital stay, did not match his signature on file at the bank in 7 separate measurable characteristics. Tommy had forged it. Not cleverly. Patricia said later that most family financial abuse cases aren't clever, because the perpetrator never expects anyone in the family to look closely enough to catch it, and by the time someone does, there's a paper trail a mile long, built by a person who never imagined he'd be questioned. We held the confrontation in Patricia's conference room, 6 weeks after the funeral. My father sat at the head of the table, thinner than he'd been even a month before, a man who had lost his wife and was about to lose the last comfortable version of his understanding of his own son in the same short stretch of time. Tommy sat across from me, and Diane sat beside me, which I know struck Tommy as strange, the sister he'd never known walking in as if she'd always belonged there, though he had bigger things to be unsettled about that afternoon than the seating arrangement. Patricia laid it out plainly, without theater, because she said theater was for television, and this was somebody's actual family. The house sale, the refinance, the $63,000 from the joint accounts, the forged signature, dated to the exact days my father lay in a hospital bed with a heart monitor taped to his chest. Tommy's face went through several things while she spoke. Defiance first, then a kind of cornered anger, and finally, when Patricia set the forensic examiner's report on the table in front of him, something that looked almost like relief, the particular relief of a person who has been carrying a lie so long that having it finally land, even badly, feels better than the weight of holding it up any longer. I was drowning, he said, and his voice cracked on the word. After the divorce, after losing the job, I had nothing, Claire. Nothing. And I watched you with your house, and your husband, and your kids who actually respect you, and I watched Dad finally give me something that felt like being trusted for once in my life, and I told myself I'd pay it back. I told myself it was a loan. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like exactly what every person who's ever done this says, but I want you to know I never once looked at Mom in that state and felt good about what I was doing. I hated myself every single time. I just didn't stop. You forged Dad's signature while he was in the hospital, I said, while his heart was failing. Tommy, that's not desperation, that's calculation. I know, he said, and he put his face in his hands, and for a long moment, nobody in that conference room said anything at all. My father spoke last, and what he said surprised all of us, including, I think, himself. I gave you the power of attorney because I thought I was finally giving you a chance to be somebody your whole life had made hard for you to become, he said to Tommy, his voice steadier than I expected. And the whole time, I wasn't paying attention to what it was costing your sister to be passed over, again and again, the way I've been doing since before either of you were born. I have spent 40 years punishing myself for a decision I made when I was young and scared, by loving my children unevenly, like unevenness was some kind of penance. I did that to you, Claire, and apparently, without meaning to, I built the exact conditions that let this happen too. I don't know how to fix any of it, but I know I'm done pretending it isn't my fault as much as it's his. It wasn't forgiveness, what he said. It wasn't even close to enough, not yet. But it was the first time in my entire life I had heard my father take responsibility for the scale he'd spent decades tipping, and something in me, some old brittle thing, finally allowed itself to soften, just slightly, just enough to keep listening. What happened after that meeting took the better part of a year to fully resolve, and none of it moved as fast or as cleanly as it does in movies, which I think is its own kind of true ending, even if it isn't a satisfying one in the moment. Patricia advised us that we had two paths. We could pursue criminal charges, elder financial exploitation, and forgery were both prosecutable in Ohio, and given the forensic evidence, a conviction was likely. Or we could pursue a civil resolution, a restitution agreement, enforceable by the court, that would require Tommy to repay what he'd taken over a structured timeline, combined with a formal amendment restoring the trust to its original equal split, all without a criminal record attached. My father was the one who asked me what I wanted to do, which was itself a strange kind of gift. The first time in my life he'd deferred a family decision to me instead of Tommy. I sat with that question longer than I expected to. Part of me wanted Tommy to face real consequences, the kind that would make him understand, in his bones, what he'd done. But a bigger part of me, when I was honest with myself, understood that a criminal record would follow him for the rest of his life, would make it harder for him to ever work again, would very likely guarantee that whatever fragile threads were still holding our family together would snap for good. And underneath all of that, there was a simpler truth. I didn't actually want my brother in prison. I wanted my money back, and I wanted him to understand what he'd cost all of us, and I wanted, somewhere underneath the anger, for there to be a version of this that still left room for him to become somebody better than the person who'd forged our father's signature in a hospital room. We chose the civil path. Tommy agreed to a restitution schedule, the full amount, $63,000 from the accounts, plus the improperly diverted refinance funds, repaid over 6 years, secured against his portion of any future inheritance. The trust was restored to an equal split between the three of us, because by then, after weeks of DNA testing and a long, careful conversation with a family law attorney, Diane had been formally recognized, added to the estate documents my father revised, with what felt to me like genuine relief rather than obligation. She should have always been part of this family on paper, my father said, the day he signed the amended documents. The least I can do now is make sure she's part of it in every way that's still possible. Tommy moved out of Millbrook the following spring, taking a job with a cousin's hayfack company 2 hours away in Dayton. A fresh start he said he needed. Distance he said he needed even more. Our relationship since then has been careful. Not broken, exactly, but not what it used to be either. We talk on holidays. He sends the restitution payments on time, every single month, without fail, which Patricia says is more consistent than she typically sees in cases like this, and which I choose to take as a real, if small, sign of the man he's trying to become. I don't know if I fully trust him yet. I'm not sure I ever will, completely. But I've stopped needing to have an answer to that today. Some things take longer than a single year to know for certain, and I've made peace with letting this be one of them. My father's health continued its slow decline over that year, the heart weaker every season, but something in him seemed lighter too, in a way that had nothing to do with his body. He started coming to Sophie's soccer games without being asked. He started calling just to talk, no occasion required, something he had genuinely never once done in my entire life before that year. He was not, in the time he had left, a perfect father making up in months for 4 decades of unevenness, but he was trying, visibly, deliberately, in a way I had never once seen him try before, and I found that I could meet him partway, even while still carrying the parts of it that still ached. He passed away 14 months after my mother, quietly, in his sleep, the way she had gone, as if, in the end, some part of him had simply run out the string, once he'd finally said the things he'd spent his whole life too afraid to say. At his funeral, in the very same room where Diane had first walked through the door and split my life into a before and after, I stood up and said something I never could have imagined saying a year and a half earlier. My father wasn't a perfect man, I told the room. He carried a wound most of his life that none of us understood until the very end, and it cost some of us more than it should have. But in the last year of his life, he found the courage to finally look at that wound honestly, instead of letting it keep shaping how he loved the people around him. I think that's its own kind of bravery. I think it's the bravest thing I ever watched him do." End quote. It's been almost 2 years now since Diane walked into that funeral home and asked a question that unraveled everything I thought I understood about my own family. I wish I could tell you the unraveling was worth what it cost. My mother's death, my father's, the slow and still uncertain repair of my relationship with Tommy, but grief doesn't work like a ledger you can balance that way, weighing whether the truth was worth what it took to get there. The truth simply is what it is, and what's left to decide is only what you build with it once you have it. What I built, more than anything else, is a sister. Diane comes to Millbrook most months now, sometimes just for a weekend, sometimes longer. She's slowly teaching my kids to make our grandmother's biscuit recipe from the card in the recipe box, which somehow, impossibly, she remembered the smell of from a single visit our mother's cousin had made to her adoptive family's house when Diane was 7 years old. A stranger at the time, she'd thought, a woman who'd cried when she looked at her, and never explained why. A mystery Diane had carried unresolved for over 30 years, until the letters finally explained it. Sophie has taken to calling her Aunt Diane, without any of the hesitation I expected, the way kids sometimes absorb a new family member more easily than adults do, because they haven't yet learned all the complicated reasons grown-ups find to hold each other at arm's length. Last spring, on what would have been my mother's 71st birthday, Diane and I drove out to the cemetery together and sat on the grass in front of the shared headstone, my mother and father, buried side by side, the way they'd been married for over 4 decades, despite everything neither of them ever fully said out loud to each other. We brought the green box with us, the letters still tucked inside, and we read a few of them out loud to the quiet spring air, the way you might read a story to someone you love, even after they're gone, because some stories are worth telling twice. "She would have loved you being here," I told Diane, and I meant it more than I think I'd ever meant anything. "I like to think she already knew, somehow," Diane said, "that wherever she is, she knows we found each other, that the letters finally got read, even if she never got to hand them over herself." I don't know if I believe in that kind of thing, not the way Diane does, not the way my mother did every Sunday of her life at Millbrook Baptist, but I believe in the letters. I believe in the box she kept for 40 years, holding on to grief and hope in equal measure, refusing to let either one win completely. I believe that somewhere in the middle of losing both my parents in the span of 14 months, I gained something I never knew I was missing, not just a sister, but a fuller, truer understanding of who my family had always actually been, wound and all. My father used to say that love wasn't a pie with only so many slices, quoting my mother's own words back to her, though it took him 40 years and a wound half a century deep to finally live like he believed it. I think about that a lot now, watching my own kids with each other, watching Diane's daughter get to know cousins she never knew she had, watching Tommy's monthly restitution checks arrive like small, quiet apologies that mean more to me now than the money itself ever could. We are, all of us, still healing. I don't think that ever fully stops, not for a family that carried a secret as long as ours did, but we are healing together now, instead of apart, in the daylight instead of behind closed doors. And if my mother taught me anything in those 30 years of letters she never sent, it's that the quiet, unglamorous work of finally telling the truth, even late, even imperfectly, even after it's too late to fix everything it broke, is still, always, worth doing. Some scars don't disappear, but they can finally stop being secrets, and in my family at least, that has turned out to be enough to build something real on top of.